Thanks so much for joining. My name is Kristen Marhaver, and I'm here to talk about recent progress in coral breeding at CARMABI, especially with understudied Caribbean gonochores. Our goal at CARMABI is to solve the trickiest puzzles in coral breeding and then share the solutions with the community. We solve the puzzles through awesome collaborations, and I want to give an extra big shout out to all the people listed here who directly participated in this project with dives, with advice, and with funding. We share the solutions as many ways as we can, and so for more about what we're up to, you can go to the links you see on the screen there. So what are the trickiest puzzles in coral breeding? For us and the corals, it's achieving fertilization, getting survival to adulthood, and maintaining genetic diversity. Why are we even bothering? If this is hard, it's slow, it's very small scale, it's because we're in year 40 of a 200-year quest, and the more we do now to figure out the codes for coral spawning and coral breeding, the better head start the next generation is going to have in building reefs back. And why gonochores? Well, they can be rare and patchy, they can be disease prone, but they can also live in marginal habitats and stressful habitats. And so if we figure out their reproduction, we can use them to help us in coral restoration. For this talk, we'll assume that you know your Caribbean coral species and a little bit about larval propagation, but even if you don't, there's lots to learn and lots to enjoy here. So please hang on and stay with us. We imagine coral spawning like this, hermaphrodites releasing egg sperm bundles. And that's because our natural history is biased. We found all of the easiest stuff first. But just as often, coral spawning looks like this. Here's a pillar coral male releasing sperm into the water, and here is a female releasing eggs into the water. So we've been working on decoding pillar coral spawning for almost a decade here at CARMABI, and we've made a lot of really good progress in the last few years. The most important thing we learned from Dendrogyra is to know your reef, do your natural history. You have to really spend the time in the water to find the males and females, figure out who's doing what, know how to find a gravid colony before it spawns. And the way that you can do that is you can leverage the relatively long spawning windows that gonochores seem to have, but then you just have to put in the work and do the dives and stay underwater. As well, you really have to handle this material with care because individual eggs are much more fragile than bundles. You have to work hard to get sufficient concentration, and you have to be careful about things like sperm motility, which means using non-latex syringes, and then be very mindful about mixing the gametes as soon as you can, maybe not waiting until the lab, but maybe trying to mix them underwater. We've also found that if you feed your juveniles, they tend to be a little bit more stress resistant and a little bit more, grow a little bit faster, so we've been feeding our corals pretty regularly as well. Now let's get on to a trickier puzzle, Dichocoenia stokesii. 5 years ago, Mark Vermey and I set out to figure out when this species spawns and how to propagate it. We were starting with just 1 or 2 observations from Florida of a male that was seen during a dive, and that's it. Well, why couldn't we figure out when their spawning times were before then? Well, here's why. That's all we were looking for. It's such a fleeting moment, and even if you're looking right at it, you might not even know what you're seeing. Why didn't we figure out the females before? Well, that's why. Again, such a fleeting moment and very difficult to capture unless you know what you're looking for. We did manage to figure out what the colonies look like before they spawn, so gravid males on the left, gravid females on the right, and once we learned what we were looking for further away, it allowed us to accumulate more and more spawning observations by focusing on the right colonies at the right times. So, when does Dichocoenia spawn? We now have 5 years of observations, but please do keep in mind that this is still a draft. First, we saw them spawning in a sort of normal week of spawning, days 5, 6 after the full moon, but it went on, days 9, 10, 11, and that was kind of surprising because typically spawning corals don't spawn for that many days in a row. The next year, we kept on the pursuit and we found them spawning on days 11, 13, 15. Pretty much every night we went out, we found another colony or 2 or 3 spawning. And the only thing that stopped us that year was we ran into Thanksgiving, which is the T over on the right. And then last year we thought, well, certainly they don't spawn in that other week. They must have to take some time off between spawning events. And no. We found spawning day 22, 24, 26 after the full moon and wrapped around the lunar cycle to 0, 2, and 4. In other words, the question is no longer when does Dichocoenia spawn, it's when does Dichocoenia not spawn? And the answer is we have no idea. We can't find the start and we can't find the stop. And that's really challenging everything we thought we knew about how coral spawning works. At least in terms of time of night, it's much more predictable. The males spawn before the females. It's a narrow window after sunset. And so you're really only doing a dive for 50, 60, 70 minutes and capturing both the males and the females spawning. At least that is predictable, unlike figuring out which day they won't spawn. Development is fairly straightforward. It's quite fast and they become motile really quickly, which all helps with propagation when you are an impatient coral parent. And we've managed to have some success with grow out and settlement, and it's been really fun to watch them turn into miniature versions of their parents. The challenges are really that it's hard to find them spawning unless you know what you're looking for, and it's difficult to get a lot of material per night, but you've got weeks and weeks to figure it out, not just that typical 3 nights of spawning. And we found that the juveniles are quite robust once they get through the sort of initial die-off that you often see with spawned coral juveniles. Some of the strategies that helped us achieve this were the same as from Dendrogyra, especially diving over and over and learning to find your male and female colonies and know what they look like before they spawn, being really gentle with handling, being very clean and careful with grow out, and also feeding the juveniles, but at a low level, at a cautious level, to avoid any sort of pest outbreaks. Very quickly, 2 more species. Stephanocoenia intercepta is a favorite species we've been following for the past few years. Thankfully, we only see it spawning a few nights after the full moon, and we found some real zeros at the end. So unlike those weirdos Dichocoenia, they're giving us a little bit of a break. Very difficult to get them to settle, but once they settle, the sort of standard propagation methods do seem to apply. And Meandrina meandrites, a new passion, a new quest at CARMABI. This photo has eggs, but they're mixed in with that backscatter so you can see the eggs better in that syringe. We first got tipped off to this by our colleague Ellen Muller in Bonaire, a wonderful photographer and naturalist who saw them spawning fairly late in the lunar cycle and tipped us off to what she was seeing. We then went back in 2019 and filled in some of the dates in that same window. And just this past month, a technician here at CARMABI, Matthew James Bennett, who made it a personal quest to figure out Meandrina, has gotten really high fertilization and has started to settle the juveniles. So stay tuned for news on whether there's a start or an end to this, or whether we end up with a Dichocoenia situation once again, and stay tuned for the baby photos. Gonochores, lessons learned. Most of our assumptions about coral spawning don't really apply to the gonochores, especially when it comes to what nights they will spawn. And so natural history is really a requirement to have success with these taxa. Special handling and care is required, but they are quite sturdy once you get them past the early bottleneck, and it's really 100% worth the effort to watch these species grow, knowing that you're doing something that will help other teams and other generations of scientists and restoration practitioners. If you'd like to help us solve some of these puzzles, we're more than happy to give you advice on when to go dive and what to look for, so just get in touch, one of the links there. And I really want to thank you for joining today, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thanks so much.